It's the Matt Sager Podcast on Wednesday, October 10th. I'm Matt Sager. Welcome to the show, and I am working with an injury. Never let it be said my work ethic is anything less than rock solid. Or rather, solid as concrete, which is what I took a header on just hours ago. Some genius is doing construction, or actually, I think they might have completed their construction project and then just walked away. But in the middle of the street on 8th Street and 6th Avenue, in the crosswalk, as you're trying to cross the street and not get hit by a car, as you cross the street between 8th Street and 6th Avenue, there's just a giant hunk of rebar. It's sort of off-color, hard to see, and in this weird shape where it juts out, sticks up at about a 90-degree angle, and then quickly juts back down into the street. And when I say I took a header, I mean my knees, my elbows just ripped to shreds, blood everywhere. There's a nice image for you as I do this podcast. Your host is bleeding as he does this show, but that's not even close to how bad it could have gotten. Now, yes, I did have my iPhone XS in my pocket, which, let me give you a quick public service announcement. Always keep a case and screen protector on your phone, because the screen protector was shattered to bits. The screen itself, the phone, brand new mint condition, and thank God. This thing cost me like what I would have required for surgery if this fall had been as bad as it looked like it was going to be. Let me put it this way. I didn't shave this morning, and I felt my stubble brush against the concrete. And cars coming forward. You know, the way things work in New York is basically, if you can get away with it as a pedestrian, you tend to cross even if you don't have the light. And similarly, this is much more dangerous, and this is what was happening. Many cars will say, well, the light a few crosswalks ahead of me is changing, so let me just assume my light's going to change any minute now. So I'll start driving now. So cars were screeching to a halt to avoid running over my head. This was not a fun evening for me, but it's very fun for me to be doing this podcast. It's where I get to let out all that tension and aggression and just thank my deity of choice, whatever it happens to be today. Let's say Vishnu. Thank Vishnu I'm alive. You may substitute it with the deity of your choice, perhaps Thor. After Thor Ragnarok, I could certainly understand anyone's loyalty to the Norse myths. And speaking of Thor and all things Marvel, holy crap, I'm not changing my tune about Venom, okay? I saw it, thought about it, had lots of discussions about it. More discussions than a rather non-intellectual outing like Venom really merited. But my takeaway was, it was awful. That's speaking as someone who loves Tom Hardy, who loves Spider-Man, who loves Venom, and who's been a big fan of Avi Arad's film work for the past 20-plus years. But suck or no suck, people wanted to see this movie. I don't exactly know why. The draw was not Spider-Man, since Spider-Man couldn't be mentioned, let alone appear in the film. The villain was not Venom, but rather this sort of weird Elon Musk light-type character. The bottom line is, Venom made a crapload of money this weekend. Globally, their opening weekend was $205 million. Domestically, it was $90 million, and taking into account the complete 4-day launch, it's weird, you know, there's the weekend, and then there's the stuff where you premiere a little bit before midnight the day before, and you count some box office the day after. It already made back its budget, which, according to Sony, was $100 million, and has Sony just frothing now. Much like Venom, when he thinks of warm, yummy pancreases, Sony is frothing at the thought of how much money there is to be made, and suddenly all these Spider-Man movies that I was sure were going to be canceled. These Spider-Man movies that may or may not be allowed to mention Spider-Man. Sony's got this weird deal with the MCU, where Spider-Man's appearing in the Avengers movies, and although they own his license, they've lended him out. They're now thinking, hey, you know what? Venom was a hit. We've got in production hell, and maybe we'll put on the accelerator and start really getting to work on them. This Silver and Black, a movie that would star Spider-Man villains / occasional allies / sometimes love interests, Silver Sable and the Black Cat, and very exciting to me, Kraven. Kraven, who is not historically the most interesting Spider-Man villain. I actually despise him a lot because I'm a big animal lover, and Kraven's whole thing. If you ever saw that episode of The Simpsons where Mr. Burns sings, "See my vest? It's a real gorilla chest. My loafers are made of gophers." Yeah, Kraven's whole deal, aside from being the most obnoxious, and this is speaking as a guy of Russian descent, the most obnoxious stereotypical Russian, yes, I'm so great, I hunt things in cages. His vest is a lion's face. He's a giant asshole, but he was the subject in a storyline in the 80s called Kraven's Last Hunt, and that is what the Kraven the Hunter movie is going to be based on. It's going to be an adaptation of Kraven's Last Hunt, and Sony's already said, you know what, Marvel, we had this gentleman's agreement, but let's be honest, who among us is a gentleman in this room? We're going to put Spider-Man in the Kraven movie. Now, on its face, that is very exciting news, not necessarily for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but for Spider-Man in movies and for Spider-Man's villains. Because Mysterio is going to be in the next Spider-Man movie, and maybe they'll make that great, but Mysterio is an infamously boring villain. Kraven, certainly the Kraven we saw in the Kraven's Last Hunt storyline, is a badass who brought Spider-Man to his knees. Showed him his ugliest side of himself. He was basically Bane before Bane, but even more nasty, and it involved all kinds of exotic jungle poisons and curare and stuff like that. Having said that, I'm not 1,000,000% on board, because we're about to see Fox, another sort of stepchild Marvel offshoot that was producing Marvel movies before Marvel itself got its own studio together, but that is an awkward kind of semi-licensee of their characters and stories that's trying to figure out how to coexist with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They handle the X-Men, and they're about to, for the second time I should add, adapt the Dark Phoenix storyline. And the last time they did that, it just obliterated all the goodwill that they'd built up with X-Men 1 and X-Men 2. It made the franchise so toxic they had to reboot and start all over again. Why they would now, having done that, having successfully rebooted, said, you know what would be a good idea? Let's try that storyline again, adapting it the exact same way. This time they'll get it. And I don't think that's going to work out. So the Kraven movie, in adapting the Kraven's Last Hunt storyline, needs to take a dramatically different approach than either X3 The Last Stand or what X-Men Dark Phoenix looks like, which is another big hot mess, taking a storyline beloved by millions. Storyline that sort of defined a generation of comic fans and made people who saw the movie go, why would you ever have enjoyed this? What is this story? This is awful. And this adapting a story that really does still hold up in the books. But they just managed to fuck it up that badly, and they seem poised to do it once more. So Kraven the Hunter needs to do that very differently. Or then again, look, Venom is a huge hit. There's no denying it. Donald Trump's the president. Tim Allen had a sitcom again this year. We don't necessarily live in a meritocracy, be it politics, movies, TV, comics, whatever. So maybe they could do a terrible adaptation and make $1 billion. But I would like for them to do it well, for them to execute a faithful adaptation, because it is a great storyline. And I would hope that Spider-Man could have a fruitful cinematic existence, whether in the Marvel Universe, alongside it, coexisting in it, alongside this own sort of separate Spider-Verse. I think that would be ideal for all concerned, if the grown-ups in the room can get it together and make it work. Speaking of, Dave Bautista. I mentioned last week that Disney really let me down and let, frankly, everyone down in first firing James Gunn due to pressure and a hate campaign brought about by a notorious white supremacist hate monger who brought up tweets of Gunn's that are over a decade old that Disney knew about when they hired him for Guardians of the Galaxy and that were old news by the time of Guardians of the Galaxy 2. But this, I'm not going to say his name, but this scumbag made a big deal of letting Disney know, I'm telling everyone I know that these are all the tweets I've gathered of James Gunn making fun of pedophilia. And yes, James Gunn was very stupid to not have taken the opportunity when Disney hired him to say, you know what, let me take a couple hours and just delete all my really unfunny and rather revolting tweets. But he didn't. Disney came under fire for them, and they immediately caved, and within a day, Gunn was gone. Now, I didn't really come after Disney for that because I understood, I hate to say it, but having worked with them, I was amazed that he was able to keep his job as long as he did with those tweets up. Disney is all about their image. But then they kind of shat the bed last week when Rachel Butera, who's the voice of Leia Organa on the, now I'll be honest, this could just be because no one cares about Star Wars Resistance. I've never seen a Star Wars project of any kind, animated, movies, TV show, whatever. I've never seen one that looked so mediocre, so bad, and that had generated such little interest, and the only interest it had was negative. But in the midst of all this, during the Kavanaugh hearings last week, this dummy Rachel Butera, who is voicing an icon of feminism, the biggest icon of feminism in all of science fiction, came out and did this awful video in the middle of Dr. Ford's testimony, where she's recounting the most horrible moments of her life, destroying her life before the world. You know, to this day, she can't return home. She can't go back to her work, her family. She's under death threats all the time, due in no small part to our president going around and holding rallies and making fun of her and making her the butt of jokes, making her like the press, a target, an enemy, like his political foes. She should be imprisoned for having come forward with the most awful thing that ever happened to her because she thought it was her civic duty to describe her sexual assault. So in the midst of this most ugly moment in American history, while a victim is pouring her heart out, benefiting herself not at all, exposing herself to nothing but abuse and fear and a life probably the remainder of which will be spent on the run from lunatics. During this time, Rachel Butera, voice actor extraordinaire, who somehow landed a part on Murphy Brown, which is only back on TV as ostensibly an antidote to this awful misogynist culture we find ourselves in. This dummy Rachel Butera posts a video of herself in the middle of Ford's testimony while she's describing this horrible trauma, and she proceeds to do what, to her, is a hilarious impersonation. It's not remotely funny. It's never a good time to mock a victim of sexual assault while they're describing said assault to the world. But somehow Rachel managed to do it even more horribly than you would think, simply by that description. He goes, "I'm Dr. Blasey Ford, and I've got vocal fry. I know I still sound just the way I do when I got attacked." And a couple of people pointed out that this was the most sickening thing they'd ever seen. People like the ones who went after James Gunn loved it, and Disney really failed their moral test. If they fire James Gunn because they care about family values, but they didn't fire Rachel Butera for mocking a rape victim, if that doesn't count as family values, then Disney, my disappointment in you defies language. I simply do not have words. And Dave Bautista has from day one been extremely critical and outspoken about the firing of James Gunn, and has gone so far as to not only hint at leaving, but to flat out there on social media pretty much ask Disney to let him go because he doesn't want to continue playing the character with James Gunn not in the director's chair. Dave Bautista, of course, has played Drax the Destroyer in Guardians and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. James Gunn now is writing and quite possibly directing Suicide Squad 2 for DC, which, could go any number of ways. I'm a big James Gunn fan. I do believe in his ability to take very unlikely properties and turn them into huge hits, and there is no better evidence of this than Guardians of the Galaxy. We're talking about a raccoon, a tree, a dumb earthling, a planet played by Kurt Russell. Yes, you heard that right. A planet. Not a kung fu guy, but a planet played by Kurt Russell. And turned it into one of the biggest, most beloved franchises of all time before being unceremoniously booted on his ass by Disney. Now, Suicide Squad is a little bit different in that it's not just that it's an unlikely concept. It's one that's already had an outing that was one of the worst comic book movies of all time. So he doesn't just need to adapt this from the pages of the comics and turn it into something that is cinematic gold. He needs to rehabilitate a franchise that is dead on its feet. But I believe in James Gunn, and I'm not the only one. Bautista, ever since Disney fired Gunn, has been saying he wants to quit too. And he now wants to join specifically Suicide Squad 2. He's been tweeting about it all day today, and let's be honest, how badass would Dave Bautista be as Bane, with James Gunn writing and directing Suicide Squad 2? I believe everything and everyone can be rehabilitated, and I believe that Suicide Squad, adapted from one of my all-time favorite comic series, the Ostrander-Yale run from the 80s, is one of my all-time favorite comic book reads. It's just sublime comic book reading. It's the Dirty Dozen on steroids. In the case of a character like Bane, that would become quite literal, and I would love to see these guys reunite on this project. It would be unfortunate if Bautista left his deal with Disney, but I don't know. I don't know the legal elements of this, whether or not his involvement in Guardians was so tethered to James Gunn's involvement that this might constitute something like a breach of contract. This is legalese and well beyond my expertise. All I know is that I'd love to see James Gunn give the Suicide Squad the movie that they really do deserve, and it would be really cool if he brought Dave Bautista along as Bane or any other supervillain. I mean, he could be a pretty badass Darkseid, for instance, who was featured in the aforementioned Ostrander-Yale run of Suicide Squad from the 80s. So that would be very, very cool. As with Spider-Man, I am not convinced that it's going to be a success, but I'm intrigued and I'm hopeful. Finally, before I go off and apply lots and lots of disinfectant to my arms, legs, and a little bit under my chin, I really took a nasty fall. I want to just voice my sincere sadness. We lost another wonderful performer today. There's just too much bad news, but I would be remiss if just because I want to be happy and I want to only say happy things, to not point out that we lost another of the greats today. One you may or may not be super familiar with. I'd bet good money you've seen her in one of her many, many projects. She would fall under the category of an always working actor. Never really a superstar herself, but lots of very good credits. I'm speaking of Celeste Yarnall. She died Sunday night at her home in Westlake Village at the age of 74. She'd been fighting ovarian cancer since 2014. She did a lot of writing about it at the time, before sort of going into convalescence and trying to do her best to heal or to pass with a bit of dignity. Star Trek fans would know her best as Yeoman Martha Landon, although she only made the one appearance as that character on the original Star Trek series. She also was in Live a Little, Love a Little alongside Elvis Presley. She was the partygoer who Elvis sang, "A little less conversation, a little more action." She got up and swooned for him, and she's been in a million movies and television shows since. She was a wonderful person and a wonderful actor, and we're the poorer for having lost her. So my most sincere condolences to her husband, Nazim, her daughter, her granddaughter, her friends. You know, death is awful, but surviving that and dealing with that grief is no picnic either. So my most sincere sympathy and heartfelt condolences to all parties and everyone who had the pleasure and privilege of knowing Celeste. So on a more dour note than I would have liked, that is the Matt Sager podcast for today. Get in touch with me and be a part of the show. Send me emails, matt@mattsager.com, or call 646-535-4788. You can leave me a voicemail, tell me what you'd like to talk about, and I'll call you back and have you on the show if you'd like. You can also hit me up on social media. Twitter is @MattSager, Instagram is RealMattSager, and on Facebook, I'm The Matt Sager. I've also got a voiceover page there, it's Matt Sager VO, and this podcast's page is Matt Sager Podcast. And for more of those social media links, along with articles, blog posts, my voiceover reels, more contact information, and all kinds of stuff about me, head on over to mattsagervoiceover.com.